Thank you for joining me for this Lifeway study of the book of Psalms. This is session 5. Title is God's Promise. The text is Psalm 132, verses 1 through 14 and verse 17 through 18. The lesson summary statement is God faithfully fulfilled his promise to send a Messiah, the Lord's anointed deliverer. Have you ever sung a song and you didn't know what you were singing? This week, I was singing a song from my youth, and my wife heard me, and she was saying, "What does that mean?" And the truth of the matter is, I didn't know what it meant. And so I looked up the song and the lyrics and was surprised to learn some things about what I was actually singing and when I was a youth and now as an adult. Well, you may have had the same kind of thoughts about many of the Psalms. And Psalm 132 could be one of those Psalms that you understand it, and yet you're not sure you understand really what's being said here. In essence, the Psalm is about a promise that David has made to God to build him a house. And in turn, God makes a promise to David that God is going to build David a house. It's about a huge historical event that took place in the nation of Israel. It's bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem and establishing a place of worship for the Ark of the Covenant. This event takes place in 2 Samuel chapter 7. There are two other Psalms that mention this event, Psalm 24 and Psalm 68. This psalm is quoted in the New Testament. In fact, Peter alludes to verse 11 in Acts chapter 20, verse 30, and Stephen refers to verse 5 in Acts chapter 7, verse 46, to show you something of the importance of this psalm. I'm going to go through some of the contextual information that's found on page 52 in your Leader's Guide, and you may want to point out some of those things too. That it's a royal psalm, that it is a song of ascent, it was where it was discovered, just some things that are mentioned there in the context as well. The transition statement from the introduction to the points says that in today's study of Psalm 132, we find God making a promise in the historical context and a promise for the future. And we can be encouraged that he can be trusted because he never fails to keep his promises. The first point of our lesson is God's dwelling place, verses 1 through 10. And this passage can be divided up into two parts. There is, first of all, verses 1 to 5, David's heart for the house of God. And then verses 6 through 10 is the heart that we should have for the house of God. One of the best sources that I found in giving an explanation for Psalm 132 was a sermon by David Guzik, Guzik, on YouTube. And he walks through the psalm and gives some very fine explanation of it. You may want to take time to do that. But it begins verses 1 to 5. I'd had somebody read that. And then in terms of explanation, these are the things I'm going to point out. It says, Lord, remember David and all the hardships he endured. And I just want to open it up to the class and say, can you name some of the hardships of David? And there are a number of things where David experienced difficulty in his life and his living his life out for the Lord God. There were times when he was devoted and powerful people were against him. There were years in which he ran as a wanted man. There were times where he backslid and he experienced the difficulties and the consequences of his sin for that. There's a whole list of things that could be mentioned. But notice that it also says in verse 2, there's something else there to remember. They're to remember how he swore an oath to the Lord, making a vow to the mighty one of Jacob. The mighty one of Jacob is a reference, of course, to the patriarch Jacob, and it is used towards the end of Jacob's life, and it affirms that during Jacob's life, God had guided Jacob and protected Jacob and provided for Jacob. This is the God that David makes a vow to, the one who guides, protects, and provides, the one who keeps his promises. And then I want to point out the passion that is found here in verses 3 through 5. We don't necessarily have the oath that David made, but we certainly have the passion by which he gives his oath. And so what is all of this? What is all of this contributing to? As the people make their way to worship in this, and they're singing Psalm 132, and they're saying, remember David's hardships and remember the passion that he had for this oath to build a house for God. What is it that it's wanting to say to them in terms of their worship, in terms of their devotion? And so what I'm driving at is David was a man of courage when it came to living out his faith. He was a man that was devoted to live out his faith. He persevered in his faith despite the difficulties. When he turned away from God, he turned back to God. And so something of the spirit and the heart of David for God is to be found in our heart for God. We won the National Basketball Association championship, the Oklahoma City Thunder. And there are a number of people in our area who are passionate about the Thunder. I live in a community where OU, Oklahoma University, exists, and there are many passionate fans for OU sports. So who is someone that you know that's the most fanatic, the best fan for either a sports event, a sports team like the Thunders or OU football or women's softball? Describe them to me. What makes you, when you think of them, you think of the energy and the excitement, the devotion they have for being a fan? What are the descriptions? And my point is it's something of that is to stir the people of God as they come to worship God. He said one of the things they needed to do was to remember the hardships of David. So maybe one of the things that we could do that would prepare our hearts for worship is to remember the hardships of Jesus. So what is it about the hardships of Jesus that causes you to be more devoted, to approach this time of worship with a greater sense of sincerity? That's something I want to talk about. Then there are just a number of things that you could go into a fuller explanation. And then he talks about in verses 6 through 10, the heart that we should have for the house of God. Now notice he says, we heard of the ark in Ephrathah, that's near Bethlehem, and that would be towards the south of Jerusalem. We found it in the fields of Jair. The word Jair is woods. It's an abbreviation for Kiriath Jearim. And so the intent is that they had to look and really intensely search for it. And obviously during the reign of Saul, the tabernacle and the ark had become ignored. And so after many years, the people weren't for certain where it was. And so they went in intense search for it. And then verse 7, let's go to his dwelling place. Let's worship at his footstool. Rise up, Lord, come to your resting place, you and your powerful ark. This was a phrase that was used by Moses when the cloud would lift and the ark was to set out and follow after the Lord. Moses would say, rise up, and Lord, and come to your resting place. And so it's picturing that. Verse 9, may your priests be clothed with righteousness. May your faithful people shout for joy. Notice the connection between a righteous priesthood and the people having joy. When that happens, when God's leaders are righteous, when they're living in a way that's pleasing to God, it has a positive impact upon God's people. It causes joy. Then verse 10, for the sake of your servant David, do not reject your anointed one. So how do I intend to apply this? Well, what's being said here is they're to be intentional in their preparation for worship. And the pilgrims used this text to set the stage for a meaningful experience with God. So, what can we learn from their example to prepare for worship, God's dwelling place? What is it that we're learning from these texts that will help us in terms of preparing for worship? That would be the part of the discussion that I would go with. The second point is God's commitment. Psalm 132, verses 11 through 14. Again, I want to read through the text. I want to give some explanation of this text. But when it comes to applying the text, I want to use a bridge illustration. On one side of the board, I'm going to write God's promise. On the other side of the board, I'm going to write the blessing received. And so God makes a promise. There's a blessing that's going to be received in the fulfillment of that promise. But what are the conditional steps in between? Because in many of these blessings and promises that God has for us, He expects us to respond in a way specifically. And so that's what I'm wanting to do with this text. What is the promise that's being made? And then what's the blessing to be received? And then what are the stepping stones that goes between God's promise and God's blessing? You see, God promised the kings of David's sons, that they would sit on the throne continuously if they would obey Him. Now, if they don't obey Him, they're not going to sit on the throne. And of course, that's what exactly happened. But then there came one who was a son of David, and he trusted God, and he obeyed God, and God has set up His throne for eternity. Then I want to just take some other promises of Scripture. I will turn to 1 John chapter 5, verse 14 and 15. And I will ask that what's the promise there? And that is the promise of God hearing and answering our prayer. And so God promises to hear us, and the received blessing is an answered prayer. So what does that verse tell us about? What is the bridge? What's the stepping stones in between? I take them to Romans 10, 9 and 10. What's the promise? The promise is for all of those who ask, He will hear. And what's the blessing received? Salvation. What's the stepping stones that are involved in that? God is always faithful to keep promises, but He often invites us to participate through our trust and our obedience. Now, David's descendants failed the faithfulness test, but God kept His promise that David's throne would be established forever. And so in this third point, the coming Messiah, again, I would just simply take the time to read and explain those verses. And then after that, the way I intend to apply it is I'm going to give them a piece of paper, ask them to fold it in half, and then fold it in half again. And then when they open it up, of course, there's four squares, and I'm going to ask them to draw a horn in one square. Now, if they just simply can't draw, they can write the word horn. I want them to draw a lamp in the second square, or write the word lamp. And then I want them to draw a crown, or they could write the word crown. Now, these are the three pictures that are used of the Messiah. There's the horn, that represents His power. There is the lamp, that represents His revelation and His light to this world of darkness. And there is His crown, which represents His victory and His sovereignty. And now I want to give them some promises that are connected to those. For example, the picture of the horn, the crown, the picture of power. I'm going to give them Psalm 46, verse 1, and have someone look that up and read that. And then where there is the lamp, I want to give them the passage, James chapter 5, verse 1. Again, that will be looked up and read. God gives wisdom to those who ask. And then for the crown, Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. And I want them to write those references in the fourth box. And I want them to keep this in mind, that God keeps His promises. And He promises to be a powerful Messiah, a Messiah of revelation that shows us light in the midst of darkness, and he promises to be a victorious, sovereign Messiah. And I want them to take this home and use that during this week. God bless you, friend, for teaching God's words. I'll be praying for you.